Hello, Fantasy Football. I'm your host, Jacob Stuckey. Welcome to episode 9 of the podcast. We're going to be going over news for week 4, talking about guys you should pick up off the waiver wire, as well as players that you should start, sit, or maybe stream. So we got an action-filled episode. Super excited to have you guys. So let's get into it. We're going to talk about news, mainly injury news, but as well as big storylines. And so some big injuries that happened week 3 was, the first one was DeAndre Swift. This is one that is a little bit concerning to me. DeAndre Swift, he is the main running back for the Lions, and he's always hurt, in my opinion. I really wanted to draft him this year in some of my leagues, but I had a hard time committing to him because I feel like he's always hurt. But it sounds like he injured his shoulder and his ankle. I think reports are still a little bit muddy, so we're not fully sure what exactly happened. But he did miss part of the game. He did have to leave the game with his injury, and Jamal Williams came in and he did pretty well. And so we're still kind of waiting to hear what his injury is and if he's going to miss some time. It sounds like he might. The head coach, Dan Campbell, did kind of sound like, yeah, we may hold him out a couple of games to keep him healthy. There was a rumor that he may even be held out through their bye, so he may return in week 7. But we're not sure yet. We're still kind of waiting to hear, but that's definitely a guy to keep an eye on. We're going to be talking about Jamal Williams in the waiver wire segment. But if you have Jamal Williams, he may be worth a play for week 4 if DeAndre Swift can't go. Next guy is David Montgomery, another running back. He plays for the Bears. He hurt his ankle at first. I think there was another report that it was another part of his body. I think it was like shoulder and ankle, but head coach came out yesterday and said it's just his ankle. But he got hurt and left most of the game, which a similar story to the Lions. The backup running back came in and just had a monster day. Khalil Herbert had 20 carries for 157 yards and 2 touchdowns, which is a lot. I think he had the highest score of any running back for the week, which is pretty impressive considering that Khalil Herbert doesn't even start at running back for the team. We don't fully know if Monty's going to miss a game or not. Sounds like he has a chance to make it back, but I think that's being kind of optimistic. I think he probably will miss a game. And especially if you have a backup running back that's playing like that, the team isn't going to want to rush back their starter. They're going to want to give him some time to rest. So kind of wait to hear to see. But I think Monty will probably miss a game, but we don't know fully yet. Next guy up is Tua, quarterback for the Miami Dolphins. This one is weird. You guys probably saw the headlines on this one. The play was that he just got hit really hard. He got rocked back and his helmet hit the turf. He hit his head hit the turf really hard. It looked like he got concussion. He started to try to get back up and he was kind of wobbling around and even like fell back down on his knee. And so it looked like he was concussed. And it looked kind of like a textbook concussion. But he came back in several plays later. He finished the game. And the head coach of the Miami Dolphins, Mike McDaniels, called it a back injury. And so he said it wasn't even a head injury. His head's fine. It was a back and ankle injury, which is a little bit weird. I think they're probably going to have to investigate it. That's kind of what the reports were coming out yesterday, is that the league is a little skeptical of that, because it definitely looked like a concussion. And I'm not a doctor, and even I know what a concussion looks like. But in regards to his availability playing wise, we don't know if he's going to play Thursday yet. They play Thursday night football, and we're still kind of waiting to hear if it is truly his back and ankle. Like, those are still considerable injuries, so we're not fully sure if he's going to be available. If you just said, hey, Tua's my starter after last week, and you heard this news, you may want to just look and see what your other options are. Because my guess is that he probably won't play Thursday night. I feel like that's kind of way too soon for a guy to just recover and be able to play. If they really need him to, then he will, but he may not do very well. but I have a feeling that they may sit him a game. But we won't know until probably later today or tomorrow. So stay tuned for that. Another quarterback, this one was definitely way more severe, was Mac Jones. Sounds like he did suffer a high ankle sprain, so he's going to miss some time. We're still kind of waiting to hear the severity of the sprain, but he probably will miss several weeks. It's kind of big news, but at the same time, I don't know if there's a ton of people starting Mac Jones. You probably had another option at quarterback, or maybe you just picked him up because you suffered injuries from Dak Prescott or Trey Lance. So if you did in that situation, I'm sorry. That does suck. So stay tuned for our the waiver wire segment in regards to who you should pick up next. But Mac Jones will miss some time. Joe Mixon, I thought this one was going to be more severe. He did miss part of the game. I think it was the second half of the fourth quarter, so not a ton of the game. I think the game was kind of already over at that point, but he did leave with an ankle injury, and this is the thing that always bothers him. Last year, he did the same thing where he left part of the game, but then he continued the season. Zach Taylor, head coach of the Bengals, came out yesterday on Monday and said, hey, no, he's good. He's good for Thursday night. So that's a big good news right there. Joe Mixon will play Thursday night. But I think you still need to look for the backup because you never know if Joe Mixon is going to re-aggravate that ankle or whatnot. Dalvin Cook, running back for the Vikings. This one looked painful. This was a bummer. He hurt his shoulder. Sounds like he's been playing with a bum shoulder for a while, but he did leave the game with a shoulder injury. It sounds optimistic that he'll play through it. Sounds like it's just a pain issue. And so head coach for the Vikings kind of says, no, he should be good. So we'll kind of have to wait to see if he's going to play week 4 because they are playing in London. But it sounds like he probably will, but definitely keep an eye on him. Amon-Ra St. Brown on the Lions. He injured his ankle. I thought this one was optimistic. I thought this one was kind of a no-brainer. Like, oh yeah, he's fine. But then I recently read reports that he may miss some time. We don't know for sure. I think that may just be a rumor. But knowing Dan Campbell, like if he's willing to hold out DeAndre Swift through the bye, then he may be willing to rest Amon-Ra for a couple of games. So we still kind of got to wait to see. I think worst case, he misses a game or two. Best case is he just plays through it. But we should see soon. Minor injuries, T. Higgins, I think he hurt his toe. I think he should be good. I didn't really see a major report on that. Hayden Hurst, he didn't play very well at all on the Bengals. He's dealing with a groin injury. He probably should still play next week, but you probably don't want to play him if he's still in a lot of pain and if he's not really getting a lot of looks. I think he only had like 2 targets and 1 reception or something like that, so he didn't do very good. Stephon Diggs, everyone was freaking out because he was like laying on the sideline and it looked like he was in pain. Sounds like he's just dealing with cramps, so he should be good and fired up for week 4. Michael Thomas, these are a little more serious, but Michael Thomas and Jarvis Landry both left the game. Michael Thomas is dealing with a foot injury. He left the game and didn't return. And then Jarvis is dealing with an ankle injury and he left and did not come back either. Both of these are big news for the Saints. Jameis Winston doesn't have a ton of guys to throw to now. And so, as we'll talk about in a little bit, Chris Olave did a lot. He did a lot through the air, which is awesome. But it's also a bummer if you have Michael Thomas or Jarvis Landry. A couple of previous injuries. So guys that were already ruled out previous to week 3. Dalton Schultz, he did end up missing the game last night, which was a little bit surprising because they sounded optimistic in regards to Dalton Schultz coming back. But he did miss the game. We'll have to see how he does this week in practice in order for him to come back for week 4. I'm like kind of fairly optimistic that he'll probably come back. It sounds like he was pretty close to coming back. But we won't know for sure until practice this week. Michael Gallup was another guy, same team, similar situation. He was very close to coming back for week 3. I believe he practiced all week. And then surprisingly, they held him out through Monday Night Football last night, which is good news for them because they won the game. And so this is the best case scenario is that they get 2 of their top targets back for next week. but we'll have to wait and see as well in regards if Michael Gallup can come back or not. Hunter Renfrow, he did not play week 3 because of a concussion. He should be able to leave the protocol and come back for week 4. Zach Wilson, quarterback for the Jets, been dealing with a knee injury. We're kind of waiting to see if he's able to come back for week 4, but it sounds like the expectation is for him to come back. Sounds like the team is just waiting for him to clear through the doctors. So we should know by later this afternoon or by tomorrow if he's able to come back or not. Mike Evans, he was suspended for week 3, so he'll be back for week 4, which is good news for that Bucs team. Good news for Tom Brady because he is their main guy. All right, so that's kind of the big news. That was a lot. I feel tired after that one. But yeah, make sure you guys are paying attention to the news. It means a lot for your team because you never know if you're going to have a guy that's going to be ruled out for the following week, or even how his performance did the previous week. Because most of the time, if a guy gets hurt during a game, they're going to be dealing with that through the whole week. And it's something that as a fantasy manager, you need to pay attention to because if you don't, they could be ruled out quickly before a game. You don't realize it and you have them in your lineup. That sucks. Or they could be highly limited in a game, which will definitely affect how your team does. So make sure you're paying attention to the news. I try to get you guys caught up on everything that I deem to be super important. But if there's something that I missed, let me know. And I'd love to talk about it. All right, let's get into waiver wire pickups. This week, I feel like the waiver wire isn't super clear, at least for running backs. Running backs, there's a lot of guys that I think you should look to pick up, but they may already be owned. But we'll talk about that. And then wide receivers, I feel like there's a lot of guys that went off. So if you're struggling with wide receivers, I think this will be a really good week to pick up a guy. But starting off with running backs, all of these guys I'm talking about, unless I notify you guys otherwise, are under 50% rostered. That's how I structure my waiver wire targets. Is I'm trying to give you guys information on guys that are not rostered in over 50% of leagues. So 50% and under, that's kind of how I target. The first guy though that I'm going to talk about, he may be rostered in your league. In Sleeper, which is the platform that I primarily use, he is a little bit under 50% owned, but I know that in other platforms he probably is a little bit over 50. But that's Khalil Herbert. I talked about him a little bit. A backup running back for the Bears. He's a beast. I really like him. I've always liked him. I traded for him in Dynasty this offseason because I think he's a really good player. And I think he's explosive. I like David Montgomery. He's pretty consistent, but I feel like Khalil Herbert is that younger, faster, more explosive back than David Montgomery. Some people may argue with me on that, but I mean, we saw it in Sunday when Khalil Herbert got the ball. He had 20 carries, and I think he had like 157 yards and 2 touchdowns. That's awesome. And so we don't know what's going to happen with David Montgomery. He may come back for Sunday, but even if he does, Khalil Herbert has shown that you may even be able to flex him. And I think that's a guy that you're going to want on your team. So if somehow he's available in your league, I would go all in on Khalil Herbert. Yeah, I would spend like probably the majority of my fab on him because I think he is worth the roster. Even if David Montgomery comes back, I think he's still going to be used. And I think it could end up being like a Ezekiel Elliott, Tony Pollard kind of situation. So I would definitely go after Khalil Herbert. He's the first guy that I would pick up off the waiver wire if he's available. Next guy who is under 50% rostered for sure is Samaje Perine on the Bengals. He's a backup running back to Joe Mixon. And when Joe Mixon left, he actually had a good game. Perine had 9 carries, 47 yards, and 2 receptions for 14 yards and a touchdown, which is solid RB2 and flex numbers. I believe he got like 10, 12 points. And so that's big. I would definitely pick him up. You're probably not going to spend a lot of your fab because you're knowing that, okay, Mixon's probably going to come back. That's what he did last year. Is he left part of the game and then he came back and like didn't miss a game. And so you're picking him up, Samaje, for insurance from Mixon. But also, like, you never know if the Bengals are going to go up during a game and if they're going to need a rest Mixon, and then Samaje may come in. So I think he's good insurance, but you're not going to want to spend as much as you would spend on Khalil Herbert. So you may even be able to get Samaje after the waivers process. But if you don't have a deep bench, I would probably be careful about that. I'm mainly throwing out Samaje for those leagues and those teams that have a lot of space on their bench and are willing to stash one of those guys. I think he's a good stash. All right, a couple other running backs. They may be over 50% roster in your league, so make sure you check. They may be available, they may not, but the next guy is Jamal Williams on the Lions. We talked about him. He had another good day where DeAndre Swift left the game and Jamal Williams had a great game. And so I would definitely pick him up if he's available. He may already be taken. And even if he is taken, you could always try to trade with that manager to see if you can get a cheap running back. I think Jamal Williams, even when DeAndre Swift plays, he often still has good flex number games. So I would definitely take a look at him. Another guy who's in a similar position is Alexander Mattison on the Vikings, backup running back to Dalvin Cook. Very similar, all three of these guys: Khalil Herbert, Jamal Williams, Alexander Mattison. And they may be rostered in your leagues. They may not be. You may have a manager that has no idea who they are, and maybe they drop them. And if they did, that's when you pick them up. But Alexander Mattison, a very similar situation where if Dalvin Cook isn't able to play a game, or if he leaves the game again with an injury, Mattison is a good guy to have because he's a good running back, and the Vikings rely on him. They trust him, and I think he is a good guy to have on your team. So those are the running back waiver wire targets. There's not a ton this week that I felt were solid pickups in regards to the guys that under 50% rostered. So, but these are the guys that stood out to me, and I would definitely take a look and try to get them on your team. Wide receiver targets. Now, this is where I felt like there was quite a few. I kind of had to narrow it down a little bit, but I'll give you guys some analysis and then throw out a couple guys that you can take a look at yourselves. The first guy, though, that I think you should look for and I think you should pick up is Romeo Doubs on the Packers. This is a guy coming into the season that he had a lot of hype surrounding him. A lot of people thought, man, this rookie could be really good on the Packers with Aaron Rodgers. And we finally saw that in week 3. I think it's encouraging that we did see a positive game from him in week 3, because the first 2 weeks we were kind of like, I don't know if Rodgers trusts this guy. And then during the offseason, Rodgers was kind of critical on his rookies. And a lot of people just like took that out of proportion. But week 3, Doubs had 8 targets, 8 receptions for 73 yards and a touchdown, which is good for 21 points in some leagues. And so he had a great game. Part of this reason, though, is because Sammy Watkins and Christian Watson did not play this game. And so Aaron Rodgers had to find someone to throw to, and Doubs happened to be that guy. I would still pick him up. I think he has a lot of potential as a player. I think he's a good player, and I think he's on a good team. I don't know where the Packers are going to go in regards to playoffs this year, but he's playing with Aaron Rodgers, and so you always want to prioritize the guys who are attached to good quarterbacks. Aaron Rodgers is a great quarterback, and if Romeo Doubs is going to be that guy, you're going to want to get him on your team. So I would prioritize him. He would probably be my first wide receiver target I'm looking for. We don't know if Christian Watson is going to come back for week 4. Sammy Watkins is on IR, so he will continue to miss several games. But if Christian Watson were to miss more games, I think Romeo could be a good stream. And so definitely pay attention to him and see if you can pick him up. Next guy is Zay Jones on the Jaguars. This one is crazy because going into the season, I didn't pay attention to Zay Jones at all. I knew who he was. He's always been a guy that you can always stream a couple of weeks, but you wouldn't want to play him every week. But he's been impressive so far this season. last game, week 3, he saw 11 targets for 10 receptions for 85 yards and a touchdown, which is good for 24 points. And the nice thing about this guy is that game isn't a fluke. Week 1, he played really well. Week 2, he kind of had a low game, but he seems to be cementing himself as the number 2 option in Jacksonville. He's kind of beating out Marvin Jones for that spot behind Christian Kirk. And they're playing good. Jaguars are playing really well right now. And I think Trevor Lawrence is doing really well and spreading the ball around. So Zay Jones is a guy that I would definitely go get. I would put him behind Romeo Doubs in my list. But I think Zay Jones is a guy that you can pick up. Maybe play him right away. If you're really hurting at wide receiver, I probably would pick him up, keep him on my bench for a week or two. And then if he's still consistent, then I would lock him in. But I think right now I'm still kind of waiting to see if he's going to be able to keep up those consistent numbers. But 11 targets and 10 receptions, like, you can't ignore that. Like, if a quarterback is going to target anyone that much, that's a guy that you need to pay attention to. So definitely take a look at Zay Jones, and I would go pick him up. Next guy is Matt Collins. This is a similar situation where you're like, who is this guy? Like, who is Matt Collins? Never heard of this guy before for some people. And he was another guy like Zay Jones. He got 10 targets, 8 receptions, 158 yards, and 1 touchdown, which is good for 32 points. I didn't say it, but he's playing for the Raiders, in case you didn't know. And Derek Carr just found him. He just targeted him all game. He got 32 points in week 3. Week 2, he got 11 points for 8 targets and 5 receptions. And so back-to-back weeks, he had good games, and Derek Carr looked for him. And so I think he's a guy that's noteworthy of picking up and taking a look at. The thing you got to pay attention to, though, is that Hunter Renfrow did miss this game. And so Renfrow should be coming back week 4, which is going to take away from Matt Collins' usage. But the past couple of weeks, Devontae Adams has been getting shut down. And with Adams being shut down, Matt Collins has been taking that opportunity and making it his own. And so I definitely would take a look at Matt Collins. I don't think I would play him right away. I think he's a similar guy to Zay Jones, where I would pick him up, have him sit on my bench for a couple of weeks, and then depending on the matchups, I would probably stream him coming up. But I think he's worth a stash for sure. I think he's a guy that you should go pick up if you have the room. And I think there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of hype surrounding him. So I would definitely pick him up. KJ Osborne, another wide receiver. He plays for the Vikings. He had a kind of a similar situation where he's a third wide receiver on his team. He's got a lot of hype surrounding him coming into the season. But we weren't really sure. We weren't really sure how he was going to be getting used by Kirk Cousins. But he closed out the game for week 3, which is awesome. He had 8 targets, 5 receptions for 73 yards and a touchdown. And he scored the game-winning touchdown, which is encouraging. He got 18 points. So he had a really good game. I think this is another guy that you want to pick up, keep him on your bench, and then maybe stream depending on the week. As we've seen from him and the Vikings, he's not going to be getting this every week. Justin Jefferson, I think I got 4 points for week 3, which in my mind allowed KJ Osborne to do well. So Justin Jefferson is not going to get shut down every week. He's going to start doing well. And when he does, that's going to take away from KJ. So keep that in mind. If you pick him up expecting to play him every week, probably won't be able to. But I think he definitely has a lot of opportunity. So I would take a look at him. The last wide receiver. See, I told you there's a lot of wide receivers to talk about. Last one I want to talk about is Isaiah McKenzie on the Bills. He had 9 targets for 7 receptions, 76 yards, and 1 touchdown. Good for 21 points. This guy, I like him, but he's kind of hit or miss. He has big games, and then other games he does nothing, like we saw in week 2 from him. But if you're struggling at wide receiver, he's another guy, similar situation where I think you can pick him up, have him on your bench for a little bit, and see how he does. I think he is very boom or bust, unlike some of these other guys. I would say Zay Jones, I probably trust a little more than Isaiah McKenzie, because I think Zay Jones is kind of that wide receiver 2. But in regards to the Bills, sometimes Josh Allen just kind of throws to everybody and anybody. And so beyond Stephon Diggs, Josh Allen tends to spread it around, which means that it's not very consistent in who gets the ball all the time. We saw Devin Singletary get a lot of receptions this week. And so I think Isaiah McKenzie would be a good pickup. But I'm probably not going to feel really good about playing him every week, at least for right now. I'm hoping that eventually we'll be able to do that, but I think he's still worth a waiver wire pickup. A couple of tight end waiver wire targets. First one I think you should definitely pick up is David Njoku on the Browns. He had a really good game for Thursday Night Football. He had 10 targets, 9 receptions for 89 yards and 1 touchdown, which is good for 24 points. And he is under 50% rostered. So if you're struggling at tight end, I would go pick him up. I think he would be a guy that you possibly could just put in your lineup and play, especially in the tight end position. It's pretty tricky. It's pretty tricky finding and streaming these tight ends where you often will bounce from tight end to tight end. So if you experienced that last week, maybe you're like myself and you played Hayden Hurst and you're like, man, I didn't feel good about that. I would look to a guy like David Njoku and I would just put him in your lineup and see how he does for the following week. But I think he has a lot of upside, especially on that Browns team where they don't have a lot of guys that Brissett can throw to. The main guy is Amari Cooper. Then after that, it's nobody. Kareem Hunt, Donovan Peoples-Jones, but he didn't really do much week 3. And so I think if Brissett can establish that connection with Njoku, I think he would definitely be worth a pickup, but I think you can play him as well. Another tight end, similar situation, is Tyler Conklin. I really like Tyler Conklin. He came from the Vikings and now he's on the New York Jets. A big worry for me, though, is he was splitting time with CJ Uzomah, and then Uzomah was hurt last week for week 2, and so Conklin had a really good game in week 2. And the test was going to be this week because this is when Uzomah was coming back, and it was no problem for Conklin. Conklin had 8 targets, 8 receptions for 84 yards. That's good for 16 points. And Uzomah had like 2 points. Like, they barely played him. And so I think that's good for the Jets. They're finally committing to the better player, in my opinion. And so I would definitely pick up Conklin. I think he would be not only worth a pickup, but I think he's a guy you can just put in your tight end position. And I don't think he's going to get 16 points every week, but I think he's a good player, and I think he's a guy that you definitely can play from week to week. Quarterback waiver targets. I'm not going to go too in depth in these guys because I'm going to talk about them in my next segment, but Trevor Lawrence, if Trevor Lawrence is available in your league, I would pick him up, especially if you're struggling at quarterback. He had a great week 3. He had 3 touchdowns. I think depending on your league, he probably got you 30 points, which is awesome. But I think he's a guy that you definitely need to take notice to, and I think you should pick him up if he's available. Another guy, now this one's a little weird, and I'm a Seahawks fan, and even for a Seahawks fan, it's a little weird, but Geno Smith, I think you can pick him up and possibly stream him for week 4. I feel nervous about this. I'm not telling you to play him every week, but if you're really struggling at quarterback and if you're kind of just streaming based off matchups, I would pick him up. He's definitely under 50% rostered in your leagues. And so he played really well against the Falcons, and I think he could be worth playing in week 4 as well. So those are my waiver wire targets. This week was a little weird. I didn't feel like there was anybody that completely stood out to me in regards to, hey, you need to pick this guy up. There were some notable injuries that we talked about, but there wasn't anyone that, as of right now, is going to be gone for like 6 to 8 weeks. So when guys are gone for a couple of weeks, it's hard to justify spending a lot of fab on those waiver targets. But all of those guys I mentioned, I would definitely take a look at. If you're struggling at a specific position, know what that position is and do your research on the waiver wire targets available to you. If you're really struggling at running back, all those guys I just listed, go look into them for yourselves, and kind of decide based off their opportunity and their situation which guy you want to spend the most fab on. That's what I would do. That's kind of how I operate when I look at guys like that. Yeah. And so that's what I would do for that. So next segment I want to talk about, we're going to talk about set, stream, and sit. Set meaning guys that you can put in your lineups and start every week. You can set and forget about them. Stream guys that you want to play in your lineups depending on the matchup. You're not going to play them every week, but if they're playing a favorable matchup, you may play them. And then talking about sitting guys that aren't doing very well, sitting those guys and playing other players instead. So I got several names that I want to talk about, and we're going to kind of go through each category. The first guy I just mentioned, I want to go in depth about a little bit, is Trevor Lawrence. This is a guy that last week I felt like you could stream him. I talked about him a little bit in last week's episode, but after week 3, I'm feeling like you can set him. I'm feeling like you can set and start him. And the reason why is that I think he's been really impressive on the Jaguars. I think the problem with him last year was that he didn't seem like he was a very solid decision maker yet. He felt really spotty. He would make decisions where you just felt like he was under pressure all the time, and that he didn't really know how to handle that pressure. I feel like this year he's shown a lot more confidence in his game. Now I'm not a quarterback expert, obviously, but I think even from a fan perspective, a regular fan's perspective, he's looked a lot more comfortable on his team. He's looked like he is a lot more in command of what's going on, and I think that has definitely helped him. Not only that, but he also has better receivers. He has better weapons. He has Christian Kirk, who has been that security blanket for him. He has Zay Jones, who has played really well. He has 2 solid running backs in James Robinson and Travis Etienne. And so I think that those are guys that you want to have around you as a quarterback, and especially a good quarterback. Like we saw with Joe Burrow, it took him a little bit to get going, but once he got going, he just felt comfortable to sling the rock. And that's kind of how I feel with Trevor Lawrence. He had a 3-touchdown game in week 3. That's something that you can't ignore. I think eventually he will start to cool down. I don't think he's going to have 3 touchdown games every week. But I think he's a guy that if you're struggling at quarterback, maybe you had Dak Prescott, maybe you had Trey Lance, and maybe you're just streaming quarterbacks right now, I would definitely prioritize getting Trevor Lawrence. And I think he's a guy that if you had him as your backup, I would just put him in and play him every week. And even for myself, like, I'm in a league where my starting quarterback is Kirk Cousins. And even for me, I like Kirk Cousins to where I'm starting him every week. But Trevor Lawrence has done well enough where, in my mind, I'm considering getting Trevor Lawrence and playing him over Kirk Cousins. I think they're in similar situations, so I may stick with Kirk Cousins. But if Trevor Lawrence continues to do well, if he has another 3-touchdown game for week 4, he's going to be a guy that everyone's going to say, oh yeah, play him every week. And so some people may think this is a little early saying that you can play him every week, but I think it's going to happen eventually. And I think he's definitely going to continue to do well. So I would definitely set and start him, put him in your lineups, and fire him up, especially if you're struggling at quarterback. Another guy I mentioned briefly is Geno Smith. I don't think he's a set. I don't think that you can start him every week. He makes me really nervous. But I think you can stream him in week 4. He's playing at the Detroit Lions. And as we saw with the Vikings, Kirk Cousins, I think he has better weapons than the Seattle Seahawks. But Geno has Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf. And I think those guys definitely can torch the Detroit secondary. So I would play Geno Smith against the Lions if you're struggling at quarterback. There probably are better options. Like, I would go Trevor Lawrence first, obviously. But if there isn't any other options, I would be willing to play Geno for week 4, which is scary to say because you never know what you're going to get with Geno. But I would stream him. Another stream option is Cam Akers. I think we're getting closer to feeling better about Cam Akers for that high capital guy that you spent during your draft. But he had a good game, an okay game. I guess I should probably say instead for week 3. He had 12 carries for 61 yards and a touchdown. That's good for 10 points because he did fumble. And so I don't know what McVay is going to do to him because of that fumble. But Henderson barely played. Henderson barely got any carries, which I kind of had a feeling that it would kind of go back into Cam Akers' favor. I would consider streaming him against the 49ers for week 4. I don't think you can play him every week quite yet because you're still a little nervous about the timeshare with Henderson and how McVay feels about him. But I think he's a possible stream. Another guy, this was not entirely surprising. We've talked about him on the podcast before, but Devonta Smith on the Eagles, he posted the number 1 overall wide receiver finish for week 3. He had a 30-point game for full PPR, which is crazy. It's crazy because a couple weeks ago we were talking about, man, what do you do about him after week 1? He got 0 points. And my opinion was that he was going to get going eventually. I didn't really think that he was going to have a number 1 finish like that for week 3, but he had a really good game. And Jalen Hurts looked to him early and often. And I think he's a guy that now I think you set him. I think you set and forget about him. Keep him in your lineups every week, especially in that flex position. I think you can play him as a wide receiver too, but if you're playing in 1 or 2 flex positions and he's one of those guys that you're considering playing or not playing, I would go ahead and trust him and keep him in there. I think he's going to continue doing well. I don't foresee him having 30-point games every week, but in week 2, I believe he had a 8-point game. I think he had like 80 yards. So maybe it was a little more than 8 points, but I kind of foresee that happening. I kind of foresee him getting like 5 receptions for 80 yards. I think that's a really good flex game. So I would set him, put him in your lineups, and I think you can trust him for week 4. Next guy is Brandon Cooks. This one was hard for me because I am a Brandon Cooks owner in one of my leagues. I really don't want to, but I think I might sit him this week. He's made me really nervous the past couple of weeks. He's on a bad team with a quarterback that has not been playing very well, but he's the main guy on his team, and that's the reason why I have a hard time fully committing to sitting him, because he gets a lot of targets. He's the target monster on the Texans team. He gets at least 6 targets a game, and I think he's a really good player. I think he still has a lot of juice in the tank, but the problem is he's a quarterback that isn't able to utilize him, and in that situation, you may want to look elsewhere and see if there's another guy you can play instead. So in my specific situation, I have Tyler Lockett on my bench. And so I've been starting Brandon Cooks, but I have Tyler Lockett on my bench. And Tyler Lockett has been getting 11 targets with 9 receptions the past 2 games. And that's hard to ignore, even though I don't think Geno is very good, but Geno's been playing impressively. And so I'm looking at starting Tyler Lockett over Brandon Cooks for this week. I think if you're really struggling at wide receiver and if you're really struggling at your flex position, you may want to keep Brandon Cooks in. But if you have another guy like Tyler Lockett or someone like that, I would definitely consider playing him instead of Brandon Cooks, which is hard to say. I think eventually Brandon Cooks will start doing well. I think it's just a matter of time until he turns those targets into production. But I think it's a hard thing to trust, especially because I think he got me 4 points, and that hurt me a lot. It hurt me a lot having him in my flex position and only getting me 4 points. So I would consider sitting him if you have a better option. Another possible sit, which I feel better about sitting him than Brandon Cooks, kind of feel more confident about it at least, is DJ Moore, which hurts. It hurts to say. I think DJ Moore is a good player. But it's hard. It's hard to play him because of how inconsistent he is right now. I don't think he's developed that chemistry with Baker Mayfield quite yet. And he's in a similar but different situation than Brandon Cooks, where similar in I think they're really good players that are being underutilized and they're underperforming. They're different in Brandon Cooks is the main number one option, and there's no one really else on the Texans at all to throw to. Like at all. Like you have Nico Collins next up. And sorry, Nico Collins, but that doesn't give you a whole lot of options for the Texans. So Brandon Cooks is kind of the main guy. But for the Panthers, there's other options. You have Christian McCaffrey, who I think the Panthers need to start throwing to more. A lot of people are surprised that they haven't been. I think Christian McCaffrey is going to start getting more receptions. You have Robbie Anderson, who, like we saw, I believe it was in week 2, he went off. He had a really good game. I think it was week 1, actually. And then they just got Laviska Shenault, who had like a 60-yard touchdown reception on Sunday. And so you got targets in Carolina, and Baker Mayfield, how he's been playing right now, he's been spreading it around. I don't know why he doesn't look to DJ more and more. And I don't know if that's a more problem. I don't know if that's a offensive scheme problem or if that's just a bigger problem. But fact of the matter is, I don't feel good about playing DJ Moore right now. I would feel better about sitting him if I have a guy to play instead. And so until he starts getting going. So if you have a Tyler Lockett, I would definitely play him over DJ Moore for week 4. But if you don't, if you're struggling, then you're gonna have to play him. But I would try to look elsewhere if you can. Michael Carter Jr. on the Jets. He's a stream. I've kind of been seeing him as a stream for the past couple of weeks. He didn't really have a good week 3. It was kind of iffy. But I think with Zach Wilson coming back, hopefully in week 4, I think Michael Carter is still a stream. Next couple of games coming up is Pittsburgh, Miami, and Green Bay. And so you may feel a little iffy about Pittsburgh and Miami, which I totally understand. So if you have other options, you may look at those guys first. But I think Michael Carter can still be a stream. I think he's a guy that will still get receptions and still get enough carries to make him relevant. Now we got a big set. I view this guy as someone that you need to play every week. I think he proved that on Sunday, and I think he's a great player, and that's Chris Olave on the Saints. He had 13 targets, 9 receptions for 147 yards. So that's good for 26 points. And a big reason for that workload is because Michael Thomas and Jarvis Landry both left the game. We don't know if they're coming back. And even if they do come back, Chris Olave has shown enough chemistry and enough dependability with Jameis Winston to make him relevant. Even if all 3 of those guys are there, I think Chris Olave will still get plenty of targets, and I think he will still get plenty of work. And he's a guy that I would gladly play as a flex player, or even maybe a wide receiver 2. I think he's getting there. He may not be a wide receiver 2 quite yet, but I think he's getting pretty close to it. But he's a guy that I definitely would set in my lineup and play him every week. Another stream, I have Russell Gage for the Buccaneers. He had a huge week 3. 13 targets, 12 receptions, 87 yards, and a touchdown. Good for 24 points. Big reason for this, though, is because Mike Evans wasn't there because of his suspension, and Chris Godwin is still injured. So he was like the only guy. I think Perryman was dealing with an injury as well. So Russell Gage was like the main target on Sunday, and Tom Brady needed to throw to him. And so I don't think that's going to continue every week. Mike Evans is coming back for week 4. But I would still maybe considering streaming Gage. Coming up, he has the Chiefs, Falcons, and Steelers. I would consider playing him for week 4 against the Chiefs, but I definitely would play him in week 5 against the Falcons. I think depending on how he does in week 4, but that's kind of how I see him right now. I think he's a possible stream. You're not going to want to lock him in and play him every week quite yet, but I would have him on my team, probably keep him on my bench. And depending on your needs, I would stream him for week 4. All right, so that was all of my set, stream, and sit targets. We're going to talk about trade targets really quick. Couple of buy low options. Buy low running back that I think you should look for because of the commitment the team has to him as well as his workload is Josh Jacobs. He hasn't really been producing a ton. Like, he hasn't really been going off for 20-point games, but last Sunday he had a really good game, and I think good enough for RB2 and definitely a flex spot. But he had 13 carries, 66 yards, 5 receptions for 31 yards. So that's good for 14 points in full PPR. And because of his receptions, like, this is something that everyone has had an issue with Josh Jacobs for the last several seasons, is because he has not been getting targets and receptions from the Raiders. This is something that's been really frustrating because people know he can catch. And so the fact that he got 5 receptions in a game is huge. That's huge. If he's able to continue that, that's a guy that you want on your team. Now, the Raiders are a little worrisome. They're 0-3 right now, so I understand that part. But I think the fact that they're fully committed to Josh Jacobs is huge. Going into the season, I myself, as well as other people, were worried that he was going to get carries taken away from him, that the team was going to start going to Zamir White, going to Brandon Bolden. And while they'll use Brandon Bolden in different situations, they've made it clear that Josh Jacobs is a guy that they want to lean on. And I think Jacobs has played well enough to show that he deserves that. So I think he's a guy you could trade for pretty low. I'm thinking about trading for him. I had an opportunity to trade for him with Tyler Lockett. So Tyler Lockett for Josh Jacobs. I think after last week, that's probably pretty fair depending on the position that you need. So if you're hurting at running back, you can probably get him for a wide receiver like that if you have a lot of wide receivers. I like the upside of Lockett more than Jacobs. But in regards to positional need, Jacobs is a guy that you probably should look for if you're really in need of a running back. Buy low wide receiver, he may be hard to buy low on right now, but that's Michael Pittman. He had 9 targets, 8 receptions for 72 yards and 15 points on Sunday. I think he kind of might be hard to buy low, but I think you might be able to, mainly because of his injury last week. But when he came back from his injury, he showed that immediate connection with Matt Ryan. And we saw from week 2 to week 3 how much better the Colts looked with Michael Pittman in the lineup. Now, I'm not fully sure what you'll be able to trade for him, but if somehow the manager doesn't love that week 2 from the Colts when they got shut out, and if they don't feel super confident in Matt Ryan, I would try to get Michael Pittman from him. You might have to pay up a little bit, but it doesn't hurt asking the manager, hey, who would you want from Michael Pittman? That's kind of how I treat things. If there's a guy you're interested in, just shoot the manager a text or a message and say, hey, I'm interested. Who would you want from my team? And then go from there. Buy low tight end. You could have bought him really low last week before week 3, but now he might be a little more expensive, but I think you can still buy low on him. But that's Kyle Pitts. He had 8 targets, 5 receptions for 87 yards, good for 13 points. Now, this is what we saw from him last year. He started off really slow. He had these like 4-point games. He wasn't really getting thrown to. He wasn't really getting many receptions. And then the back half of the season, he had like 8 reception games every week. He did really well last year and for full PPR. And so I would try to buy low on him if you're struggling at tight end. I think he's a really big volume kind of guy. And even with Drake London, we saw that on Sunday against the Seahawks, Drake London and Kyle Pitts did really well. So they can work together. I think Mariota has played decent enough to where he can get 2 of those guys involved. And so I would try to buy low on Kyle Pitts. And I think it's not too late, but I think you should do it this week because after next week, I don't know if you'll be able to buy low on him. Couple buy low quarterbacks. I'm looking at the quarterbacks that should be performing, but they haven't been. Patrick Mahomes, he had a 1 touchdown, 1 interception game. That's less than 20 points. You're probably not going to be able to buy low on him just because he's Patrick Mahomes. But if somehow you're able to, I would go for it. But it's probably unrealistic because the Pat Mahomes manager is probably like sticking to him, and they're probably holding to him pretty tight. But I would inquire about it, say, hey, who would you want for Patrick Mahomes, and go from there. I think he's going to be a lot easier to get than a Lamar Jackson, obviously. So that's the reason why I have him in my buy low category. But another quarterback, which I think you probably will have a better chance with, is Kyler Murray. He has not been playing up to snuff. He scored no touchdowns in week 3. but he threw 314 yards on 58 attempts, which is a lot. That's a lot, especially for Kyler Murray, who normally runs. He's kind of shown this season that he hasn't been running as much as he has been past several seasons. So the reason why I would try to target him is because D-Hop is coming back eventually. I believe he's coming back week 7, and I think that's just going to make their team a lot even better. And so I would look to try to target Kyler Murray. I'm not exactly sure what it'll take to snag him. It's hard trading for quarterbacks because you kind of have to give them a quarterback instead. So maybe see if you can leverage like a Trevor Lawrence or Kirk Cousins and maybe a wide receiver and a running back if that team's hurting. But I would just inquire about it because it doesn't hurt to ask. A couple of shoot your shot guys, big name guys that are having off weeks that you might be able to snag. You might be able to inquire with the manager and see what it'll take. But big name guys that had kind of off weeks for them, or Justin Jefferson, he had a really bad week. He had 4 points. If the Justin Jefferson manager is desperate right now, you might be able to get him. Week 2, he didn't really have a good week either. And so I would try to inquire about him, see what it'll take to get him. Because I think eventually he's going to pick it up, and I think he's gonna kill it the rest of the season. Jamar Chase, he's still kind of having like an average season so far. He hasn't been doing terrible. I think he got at least 10 points for week 3. But he's another guy that I would inquire about, see what it'll take to get him, because I think he's going to start picking up as well and do really well. Delmonte Adams, he's in a similar situation. Inquire about him. I think he's worth getting. Tyreek Hill. This might be hard to get Tyreek Hill because in week 2 he had, I think, 50 points. But in week 3 he had 4. And that's what you just expect from Tyreek. That's what happens with him. I love him. I love having him on my fantasy team, but that's the roller coaster you got to ride with him. But I would try to trade for him if you're able to. Austin Eckler, he's barely getting any carries, but he's getting a lot of receptions, so he's great for full PPR, but he's terrible for standard. I would try to trade for him, see what it'll take. He's not kind of living up to snuff right now, as a lot of people drafted him as like the 3rd best running back. Jonathan Taylor, this is going to be a guy that's going to be hard to get, obviously, because he was arguably the top fantasy football draft pick this year, but he's having low weeks. He's not performing to the standard that people drafted him to be. So I would inquire with those managers, see what they need, see if they're desperate, and that's when I would take advantage and try to get a guy that's having a low week. So the reason for these shoot your shot names is because these are guys that can go off. These are guys that can have 50-point weeks like we saw with Tyreek Hill in week 2. But they also can have off weeks. And so when they have an off week, talk to that manager, see if they're desperate, see if they want a guy that's been more consistent, like a Christian Kirk or a Amon-Ra St. Brown. Like if you can leverage a couple of those guys to get a guy of this caliber, I probably would do it. Now, don't be stupid. Like you can only go so high. You don't want to trade the whole farm for Justin Jefferson. But if you have a couple of guys that are overperforming right now, I would be willing to trade them for a star that's underperforming. So that's kind of how I view things. Hopefully that helps you guys in regards to figuring out how to trade. The first place I would start is talking with that manager, seeing who they're interested in on your team, and then just striking up a conversation going from there. It doesn't hurt to ask. Sometimes people will automatically say no because they like a player, but that's totally fine. You just kind of got to go with it. So that was a lot of news, a lot of information, but I hope you guys had a good time watching and listening. Hopefully this will help you prepare for week 4. I hope your guys' teams are doing well. I know my teams are, one is doing really well, the other is kind of just doing okay, but hey, that's fantasy football. You never know what's going to happen week in and week out. And it's my job and my responsibility to try to help you guys keep up with the fantasy football news and do well with your teams. So let me know down in the comments if you have any questions. I know last week I got a lot of comments asking about trade options and if you should trade this guy for this guy. And I love that. I think that's really cool. And so let me know if you guys have any more of those questions or if you have questions about anything else. So I hope you guys have a good week and we will see you next time.